Hey, how you doing? Once again, this is Jerry Logan talking about introduction to sociology. We're going to look at global stratification. Global stratification. My last slide was chapter 9, which talks about social stratification in the United States as well as social class in the United States. So now we're going to look at it from a global point of view. Just to bring back a few definitions regarding social stratification. It refers to a system by which a society ranks categories of people in a hierarchy. In the United States, it's perfectly clear that some groups have greater status, power, and wealth than other groups. These differences are what led to what we call social stratification. Again, sociologists use the term social stratification to describe the system of social standing. Social stratification refers to society's category of its peoples and rankings of their socioeconomic tiers based on factors like wealth, income, race, education, and power. It's also a society wide system that makes inequalities apparent. While there are always inequalities between individuals that exist, sociologists are interested in the larger social patterns. It's not about individual inequalities, but about systemic inequalities based on group membership, classes, and the like. No individual, rich or poor, can be blamed for social inequality. It's just the structure of societies affects a person's social standings. So, although individuals may support or fight inequalities, social stratification is created and supported by society as a whole. Factors that define stratification vary in different societies. In most societies, stratification is an economic system based on wealth, the net value of money and assets a person has, and an income, a person's wages or investment dividends. Now, while people are regularly characterized based on how rich or poor they are, other important factors influence their social standing. One key determinant of social standing is the social standing of our parents. We talked about a little bit more about that in chapter 9, social class, social stratification in the U.S. We talk about the social mobility. And sometimes, in cases like this, parents tend to pass their social position on to their children. The book states that people inherit not only social standing, but also the cultural norms. Remember, norms are expectations of right behavior that accompany a certain lifestyle. They share these with a network of friends and family members. Social standing states become a comfort zone. It's a familiar lifestyle and then an identity as well. Now, another form of looking at global stratification, we're going to talk about the caste system. The caste system is a form of stratification, social stratification, which people's statuses are lifelong conditions and they're determined by birth. So, caste system, and just an example in India, what he had in India, where whatever your parents did, or particularly your father did, for a living, sort of say that stands out for you when you're a child. So whatever your parents did or your father did, that's what you did. So I don't care if you're 6'9", 6'10", in the caste system, your father made shoes and you were making shoes. Unlike the class system, and then the United States, where you can start out being poor, you don't have to deal with what your parents did. You can achieve a social mobility and a generational mobility, where you're able to come from poor to rich and have different type of lifestyles that you can attain based on your social class. However, in the caste system, is straight determined by birth and a lifelong condition. The caste is a form of social stratification characterized by endogamy, hereditary transmission of a lifestyle, which often includes occupation, status in the hierarchy, and customary social interaction and exclusion. Now, though the caste systems exist in various regions, there's ethnographic example is the division of Indian uh, society into rigid social groups with roots in India, ancient history persisting, they say, until today. However, the economic significance of the caste system in India has been declining as a result of urbanization and affirmative action programs. So be familiar with the caste systems as well. Class system, unlike a caste system, is based on both social factors and your individual achievement. Now, class consists of a set of people who share similar status in regards to factors like your wealth, income, education, and occupation. Unlike the caste system, class systems are open. People are free to gain a different level of education or employment than their parents. They can also socialize with and marry members of other classes, which allow people to move from one class to another. So we'll get to a little bit about Karl Marx again, just a little brief talk about Karl Marx and the means of production, which talks about what determines a social class. Now remember, the means of production is tools, factories, land, and investment capital used to produce wealth. I talked about that in the beginning chapter on introducing the sociological thinkers. You all remember Karl Marx. This term, relations of production, refers to the relationship between those who own the means of production. Remember, those are the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, and those who do not were the workers or the proletariat. You all remember Marx. History evolves through the interaction between the mode of production and your relationship to that of productions. Now, according to the Marx Hysteria, the proletariat, y'all know Marx, will assume the class consciousness when workers realize that they are being exploited by the bourgeoisie, and of course then a proletariat revolution would be inevitable. According to Marx and other social theorists who followed, a false consciousness is dangerous because it encourages people to think and act in ways that are counter to their economic, social, and political self-interest. Having a class consciousness, all workers realize is that, hey, no matter what occupation or what title that we hold, we are not the owners. Two classes, Marx talk about, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Therefore, with the bourgeoisie, you capitalist, you're an owner. Worker, you exploited worker, you are proletariat. Some people have it confused and say, hey, you know what, I'm a VP, vice president, I'm a manager. No, I'm not a person working on an assembly line. So your relation to the means of production, just say for there's assembly line, I'm on a line working, putting things on a tray, putting things on the parts. If I'm working at a plant, factory, something like that, and the means of production, I am on the line, I'm the worker, lower paying position, understandably. However, in relation to the means of production, the mode of production, we have a person who is a supervisor. Over that, there's the manager, vice president, regional director. So their relationship is a little bit different to that so-called assembly line and that factory line. So they have a higher title, more money. At the same time, Marx says you are still a worker. You are still a proletariat. Have class consciousness and realize that you all are being exploited by the capitalists. Doesn't matter what position that you have. So people are going to think a little bit different and counter to their economic, social, and political self-interest, meaning that they have a false consciousness. It's dangerous. So therefore, you know what? I'm a VP. I'm a director. Now I'm not working that line. I'm not one of them. Marx said, yeah, yes you are. You're still a worker. Grab your class consciousness and realize that everybody's being exploited. Don't separate the two. You're not the owner. Marx saw false consciousness as a product of an unequal social system but controlled by the powerful minority of elites. The false consciousness among workers which prevented them from seeing their collective interests and power was created by the material relations and conditions of the capitalist system, and by the ideology or dominant worldview and values of those that control the system, and by the social institutions and how they function in society. As they say, let that marinate and think about that for a minute. How false consciousness was created. Now, in relation, because Marx and Weber disagreement with that. Max Weber has the 3 P's, the property, power, and prestige. Property, let's say that's the wealth. According to Max Weber, the ability, y'all remember Max Weber? The ability to possess power derives from the individual ability to control various social resources. The mode of distribution gives it to propriety a monopoly on the possibility of transferring property from the sphere of use as wealth to the sphere of capital. That it gives them entrepreneurial function and all chances to share directly or indirectly in returns on capital. Same thing, I apologize. So this ability to exercise power takes a number of different forms, but all involve the idea that it means the ability to get your own way with others, regardless of their ability to resist you. For example, we think about individual chances of realizing their own will against someone else. It is reason to believe that the person's social prestige, class position, and membership in a political group will have an effect on those chances. Prestige, we talked about that before, is the respect to which a personal status position is regarded by others. Status situation, then there's the power, the ability of people or groups to achieve their goals despite opposition from others, the parties. Be familiar with prestige and power. So let's see how they work together on Weber's three components of social class. So there's property, power, and prestige, and how they all work together. So Weber said they can work interchangeably. You can have your wealth, your property can give you power and prestige. For instance, in Weber's component, he talked about how powerful, how your property, your wealth can give you power. The wealthy men who become presidents. Prestige, they talk about Warren Buffett, the wealthy in general. Now, your prestige can also give you power and wealth. If you're prestigious, power. So just saying the situation prestige is they use power with Ronald Reagan and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who were actors, to turn their prestige into power. And for prestige, it turns into wealth, like an Olympic gold medalist who can use that prestige as being an Olympic gold medalist, can turn that prestige and make money off of that based upon endorsements of products. And then your power can give you property, which is wealth. They say crooked politician, and then your power can give you prestige as well, becoming a president. They use, of course, the great Barack Obama as president of the United States. So when we look at these three components of social class, property, power, prestige, how they all are being interchangeably used, I think when I look at Max Weber, from my opinion, when I look at Max Weber and Karl Marx, and hey, just because your position is different from those of others, and in the relationships to the means of production. So no, you don't work in this similar on this factory, and yes, you have a higher paying job, but you have a false consciousness saying that you cannot, you're not one of them, but you're not a capitalist. You don't own them. They can still let you go. In my opinion, when I look at Weber's three P's, property, power, and prestige, I think about that. Weber is saying it's okay to be able to use those. So therefore, if a person has a higher, you don't work on the assembly line, you're a manager, a VP, a director, that's okay because you can turn that prestige that you have into power, which gains you more, the opposition from people that you can get your way. But it can also gain you property that can use that money, that salary to be able to get things and maybe start your own business. So I kind of see them two in different lights, in my opinion. So another sociologist or someone else may say something different. But I see in Weber's in embracing that, saying that, okay, it's okay to have these different parts of social class. It's okay that you're a manager, you're a VP, you have this higher salary, but you can do more things with this. Despite you don't have to be in that position of so-called being a proletariat, you yourself can turn around and be a capitalist as an owner. There's been many cases where people work for a company and they like, you know what, cool, I'm a worker, however, I'm going to go start my own business, and they become successful. Companies like Microsoft and different people, a lot of people have done that and say, okay, you don't like my ideas, I'm not going to just sit here and just be your worker, I'm going to be your competitor. So I feel like Max Weber just embraced that whole thing, in my opinion, of having property, power, prestige, and how they all can work for you. Indifference between Karl Marx's perspective of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that, you have to have, having the ideology of what Weber's talking about, saying that is a false class consciousness. So let's look at global stratification, the conflict perspective. Got to get to my theories, you all know me. For all my exams, it's always going to be these three theories, main theories on there. Conflict perspective, class conflict and the scarce resources. There's a limited resources. Conflict, not function, they stress is the reason that we have social stratification. Marx's argument that an ideology that members of the elite use to justify their being at the top. And when workers realize their common oppression, they will rebel. The current applications of the conflict theory in analyzing global stratification and global capitalism, which we're going to continue to talk about, they look at power relations among the different nations. So think about the different countries and where they rank in power and wealth. How national elites control the workers, conflict perspective, and how power shifts as capital is shuffled among the nations, and we're going to talk about that. Unlike the functionalists, conflicts say that just beneath the surface what appear to be a tranquil society lies conflict, which is barely held in check. So we're going to examine everything. So last chapter we looked at the United States social stratification. We're going to look at a global perspective. So this is a global economy, globalization, all of that stuff is going on. And from a historical point of view, how, nations became rich. Some got more power, more wealth than others. Let's take a look at that. Conflict theory focuses on the creation of reproduction of inequality. A conflict theorist will likely address the systematic inequality created when the core nations, which we're going to talk about that a little bit more, the core nations, much more the richer nations, exploit the resources of the peripheral nations, the poor nations. Again, the conflict theorists will likely address the systematic inequality created when core nations exploit the resources of peripheral nations. For example, I got from a book, how many American companies take advantage of overseas workers who lack the constitutional protection and guaranteed minimum wages that exist in the United States. Do so, they states, allows them to maximize profits, but it would cost. So in the United States, there's a minimum wage depending on what state you are, what city you are. There's a certain amount that you have to pay people. And if a United States or American company were to go overseas, then they can charge they can pay them at a lower rate. So minimum wage is not the same in the United States as it is across the world. So therefore, and just if a company say, hey, you know what, we're going to not pay these workers $15 an hour. We're not going to give them lunch breaks and pay them for benefits and things like that. We're going to lose money. However, we can go over to another country and we can pay them less. And the minimum wage may be way less than $10, $15 an hour. But then they can say there may be the different laws which say, well, they can work longer hours. I don't know, just throwing it out there, but depending on which country it's at. But at some point, if I'm a financial person, and I look and I say, well, I can make more money by paying people less and having them work, and I don't have to give them the type of benefits and things like that. So you can maximize profits in that way. So let's look again at the conflict perspective. This is an old chart I pulled up, kind of explains that the functionist view who receive the most resources, those who perform the most important functions, the more capable, more industrious. The conflict said those who occupy the more powerful position receives the most resources. So the functionist said, hey, we need to reward them. They have the most important functions. They're more capable, more industrious. The conflict said, nah, those who have positions of power are the ones who got the most resources. Functionist view, who receive the least resources, those who perform the less important functions, or those are less capable, less industrious. Conflict said those who occupy the less powerful positions are the ones who receive the less resources. The symbolic interactions perspective, y'all know it again, studies the day-to-day impact on a micro level, person to person, the impact of global inequality, the meanings individuals attach to global stratification, and the subjective nature of poverty. So we're going to look at as far as someone, using a global inequality would probably focus on understanding the symbolic interactions approach by understanding the difference between person to person, what someone living in a core nation, a richer nation, defines as poverty relative defines poverty, live in relative poverty, defined as being unable to live in the lifestyle of the average person in, just say, the United States country. And what someone living in a peripheral poor nation defines as poverty, which is absolute poverty, defined as being barely able to or unable to afford basic necessities such as food. So we look at some of those countries that have less. If you think about it, if you went to another country and say, wow, you know, there's a culture shock that you all experience and saying, well, they have no running water, they have no electricity, they have to get water from down a well somewhere or find it somewhere in a river. You know, it's totally different when you look at the symbolic interactions perspective on just the difference of what, you know, how someone lives. In the United States, someone has a living in relative poverty, they may have lights, gas, they got food. You know, it's a little bit different from what, you know, globally, what someone in one country may define as poverty to another country define as poverty. For example, these least industrialized nations, most people barely survive living on small farms or in villages, usually in large families. Most of them have no running water, indoor plumbing, or access to trained teachers or doctors. The countries at the bottom of a stratified global economic order, which plays only a peripheral role into international economy. And these least industrial countries are more likely than more developed countries to have authoritarian governments, uncontrolled epidemics, and low access to services such as healthcare and education. So, I don't know if some of you are a big geography person. The chart I had found was talk about more advanced economies, those in transition, the least developed, less developed, and the least developed. So, sure, you students are great with geography. You all know your way around the map. You all know these. You probably can just write in each particular one in each spot and say where everything is. However, just giving you a global overview of what we consider as the advanced economies down to the least developed. Colonialism is one thing. How do these world nations become stratified? Colonialism is an example. Now, that is a process by which one nation takes over another nation, usually for the purpose of exploiting its labor or their natural resources. These countries invaded weaker nations, making colonies out of them. After they subduing them, the more powerful countries left behind a controlling force in order to exploit these weaker nations' labor and natural resources. So, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but if you look at colonialism, just say, for example, and I have this big property, and inside these mountains I have, or these big, you know, area of land I have, and if you dig enough, you can get oil, or if you knock inside these mountains, I got gold or diamonds inside the cave and stuff like that. But these are my natural resources. I may not have access to them. Maybe I don't care. It's okay. I'm just going to leave it like it is. But someone comes into your house and take over your house and say, hey, you know what? I want the resources in your home and in your land. So therefore, they're more powerful. I might be, you know, have larger members in the family who are there, but these persons may have guns or they may have weapons and they may be less numbers. But at the same time, during a struggle or fight, they win. And at that point, they say, okay, well, we're going to take the resources out from your land. However, I want you to dig and go get it. I'm not going to pay you. I'm not going to trade you. I'm just going to take it from you. You know, and we're going to be here for a while till the job is done. We're going to stay here until we're done. And then at the same time, we're going to put our little, you know, make a colony out of it, so to say, well, this is our area now. We're going to put our flag here, and you're going to speak our language, and you know, and this is a way of subduing them. So if you look at colonialism, and I'm not saying in every single case, but I just want to use Africa for example. Colonialism, which refers to the establishment of political and economic control by one state over another, had an enormous impact on Africa. The colonial experience began in the late 1400s when Europeans arrived and set up trading posts in Africa. So this scramble for Africa was the occupation, division, and colonization of African territory by European powers during the period of new imperialism between 1881 and 1914. It is also called the partition of Africa and by some the conquest of Africa. In 1870, A long time ago, only 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914, it had increased to almost 90% of the continent. So if we look at Africa 1914, just to give you an example, based upon colors of British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Belgian, German, Italian, and independent, these particular countries kind of took over the different parts of Africa and began to look at using their, taking over their natural resources and also exploiting them as for labor as well. Give you a moment to look at this. The next slide, I want to talk more about some of the natural resources that were in these countries as well. So, for instance, in parts of Africa, there's crude oil, there's gold, there's diamonds, cotton, uranium, natural gas, petroleum, and at some point, if I come over there to this part of this Africa and I say, you know what, I'm going to take over, anybody get in my way, I want those diamonds. And so I take all these diamonds and take them all. I can get rich off of that. I can take all that gold and get rich off of that. But I'm not paying them for their labor. I'm just going to exploit them and say, you go there, you go to work, give me what you have. And that way you can gain wealth from there. Because now you're taking the natural resources that are there and you're saying, okay, you're not using it, I'll just take it, whatever maybe the reasons were, but you can become rich off of that. World system theory, getting to my other theories, how economic and political connections develop and now ties the world's countries together. Globalization and capitalism. Capitalism becoming the globe's dominant economic system. Consists really of three groups we're going to talk about today: the core nations, the semi-periphery, and the periphery nations. Let's exclude the external areas. Let's talk about those three. More on world system theory refers to the interregional and transnational division of labor which divides the world to core countries, semi-periphery countries, and the peripheral countries. Kind of like the rich, middle class, and the peripheries are underclass, lower class. Core nations, countries focus on higher skill, capital intensive production. And the rest of the world focus on low skill, not capital, but labor intensive production and extraction of raw materials. This constantly reinforced the dominance of the core countries. Nevertheless, the system has dynamic characteristics, and part of the result of revolutions in transport technology in individual states can gain or lose their core, either semi-peripheral, peripheral status over time. So you can go from semi-peripheral to peripheral, just in case somewhere a person can be middle class, go to lower class, someone lower class can go to middle class. The structure is unified by the division of labor. It's a world economy, they say, rooted in a capitalist economy. So be definitely familiar with world system theory. Core nations are dominant capitalist countries, highly industrialized, technological, and urbanized. So the peripheral nations have very little industrialization. What they do have often represents the outdated cast-offs of core nations or the factories and means of production owned by the core nations. They typically have unstable government, inadequate social programs, and are economically dependent on the core nations for jobs and aid. So we look at this for a second. The core nations, dominant capitalist country, highly industrialized technology. So therefore there's a core nation, there's a peripheral nation over there, and they have no jobs over there. They have nothing. And I'm a person, if I'm living in a peripheral nation, I have a family, I need to eat, there's no jobs. Here come the core nation, some over there and say, hey, I'm going to set up a plant here, I'll set up a factory here, and therefore I'm going to create jobs over here. So now we're happy because I still have a family to feed. I'm happy for that. At the same time, that because of peripheral nations, even if it's just trying to get to some of their natural resources, whatever they're trying to do, they're going to need, and they may need, the equipment, the highly industrialized technological advanced equipment from the core nations in order to get the work that they need. So even though they may have outdated stuff, maybe unsafe, however, if the core nations say, hey, you know what, in my opinion, when I look at this, The core nations can say, you know what, I can help you. I can set up a factory in your area, in your peripheral nation, and therefore I can help you get what you need so that you can be able to be a little bit economically dependent. However, as a core nation, I can still say, hey, whatever you have, I get a percentage of. And therefore, I'm going to continue to get rich. So you're using my equipment because you have no equipment at all. You have no factory. You have no ways and means of production, nothing like that. Here I am. I have some, this equipment. I can put it in your country. So therefore, I want to put my people over there. But at the same time, you got to pay me. And therefore, if I'm a person living in peripheral nations, it's like, hey, you know what? Okay, cool, whatever it takes, because I need a job and I need to feed my family. So whatever aid I can get. So therefore, it still sets up a position where the core nations are still going to be rich. The peripheral nations can only have so much, and they may move up to being a semi-periphery. We don't know, but it just depends. As the core nations are still at the top, and therefore the core nations are still going to be maintaining and being rich. Now, when I look at the semi-peripheral, which is in between the peripheral and the core nations, is in the middle, it's an in-between nations. They're not powerful enough to dictate policy, but nevertheless acting as a major source for raw material and expanding middle-class marketplace for the core nations, while also that they're exploiting the peripheral nations as well. This book that I read states that Mexico is an example providing abundant, cheap agricultural labor to the United States and supplying goods to the United States market at a rate dictated by the U.S. without the constitutional protections offered to U.S. workers. So to keep that in mind is just during this whole system, it's like, you know what, I'm going to still be rich, but at the same time, I still can use stuff for these other countries, but I'm going to dictate what the rate is going to be. So here's an example of Wallerstein's world system theory model. The core nations, as you see on the left, high profit consumption goods they give to the semi-periphery and to the periphery. And if we look at the semi-periphery, they're exploiting or so-called getting to the periphery. The periphery in return gives cheap labor and raw materials to the semi-periphery and the core nations, completing this world system theory model. This is another example. It's kind of hard to see this one, but it's the same thing. The high profit value added goods, as you see the core nations given to the semi-periphery and periphery. The periphery in return, as you see in exchange, they're given to the periphery, and you can see the semi-periphery still given to the core nations. Hope it doesn't sound confusing, but if you just think about the whole model, the way it's set up, and even think about it, it's how the United States and even core nations are still, gaining rich and getting money at a rate they dictate, but there's a periphery nation. They have almost no choice but to just accept the help. Dependency theories was created in part as a response to the Western-centric mindset of modernization theory. It states that global inequality is primarily caused by the core nations. As we talked about, high-income nations exploiting semi-peripheral and peripheral nations, or middle-income and low-income nations, as we all just stated, which creates a cycle of dependency. As long as peripheral nations are dependent on core nations for economic stimulus and access to a larger piece of the global economy, they will never achieve stable and consistent economic growth, as we just stated. Further, the theory states that since core nations, as well as the world banks, choose which countries to make loans to and for what they will loan funds, they are creating a highly segmented labor market that is built to benefit the dominant market countries. So let that sink in for a little bit. Dependency theory basically is, as we just talked about, the peripheral nations dependent on the semi-peripheral, but more likely the core nations, and it's hard for the peripheral nations to get. I mean, just think about the whole world and how things have been going, and look at the core nations and the semi and the peripheral nations, and if you just think more and more about it, I don't want to keep going on and give you an example after example, but as you look forward and think about it, as you do research, as independent thinkers and scholars, you'll see more of that pattern of the world system theory and that dependency theory across the world. That's all I have for this paragraph, for this chapter. Feel free, of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send me an email. Y'all have a great day.